Hi, it's Kirby Summers. Today is Friday, January 24th, 2025. We're in the middle of the third week of January. And finally, it doesn't feel like 6 degrees in New York. It's warmed up a little bit. However, it's still very cold. And as many of you probably know, it snowed in Florida and in other places where typically snow does not happen. But if you really talk about the weather, something happens on this platform. However, today's topic is Kitty Genovese. And the reason I'm going to talk about Kitty Genovese, who was unalived on March 13, 1964, it is a crime that is remembered, I thought, by everyone because of the events as they happened. I was reminded of this, and frankly, what happened to Kitty Genovese, where there were neighbors who looked on and literally did not run out to help her as they watched from their apartments, and I will be going into this, was something that I carried for many years because in my case, when I was abducted and held hostage for 5 days, I too was ignored. My screams were ignored by my neighbors. The police, who I contacted twice, did not respond before my the person who held me hostage, who no doubt was hired by my abuser to unalive me. When I contacted the police 2 times, dialing 911, they did not come as he was breaking into my home. And at one point, I'd heard the elevator coming up to my floor and heard the sound of men talking. And I thought, oh, this is a great time to try to escape. At which point I opened the door to my apartment, and 2 men did come out of the elevator, and I screamed help, and my captor grabbed my hair, holding on to like an 8-inch knife or machete. I don't know what to call this enormous knife. And the 2 men, instead of doing something to help me, and by this point I am on the ground, have fallen out of the doorway of my apartment. I'm halfway in my apartment, halfway out of my apartment. The 2 men put their key in the door of their apartment, which was just 2 doors away from where I was being held, and walked inside, and nothing happened. I was dragged back in. And so the fact that Kitty Genovese was in fact unalived while neighbors looked on became a big deal in our culture. My story, by the way, never even made it into the newspaper, although it was given to people in the news. However, I want to tell you a little bit more about Kitty Genovese. So somebody did ask in one of my podcasts where I do mention the Genovese crime family as it pertains to Wexy. Well, this makes me wonder about Kitty Genovese, and is she part of the mafia crime family? And I'm going to tell you right now, no, she's not. And frankly, I was a little weirded out by that question and that comment, because here we have a woman who paid with her life for walking home alone. She was R-worded, stabbed multiple times. No one really came to her rescue to help her at all. And instead of acknowledging her life and acknowledging the fact that she was like just coming home from working, and tragically, her life tragically ended. that the question that remains in people's mind, and it's not just the person who commented on my YouTube channel. It's a question that I suppose many people have. And I wondered, well, gee, really, is that the first thing that people think about when they think about a victim of crime? Is this person related to so and so? Well, I'm going to tell you that she was not related to the Genovese crime family. But for those of you who may be new to um, this case, I want to go over just some basics, and then I'm going to go over a very old, um, some old information that was posted back in the day when people did know about this name and this crime. So, in the early hours of March 13 of 1964, now, by the way, in 1964, in New York City, we did not have 911. In order to get the police, one had to dial 0 for operator. Okay, so after what happened to Kitty Genovese, that is when the 911 system in New York was in fact put into place. However, do you know who runs 911 today? Uh, yeah, Epi's friend, uh, who was seen entering his mansion on East 71st Street, Ehud Barak, and his carbine, renamed Revolve, and whether or not they've changed the names, I don't know. But they are now, this Israeli company is now providing the they're the intermediary. So if somebody like myself calls 911, if there was no help for me years ago when I tried to get help, I doubt there would be help for anyone who is considered to be someone that is in need of being silenced. That said, in 1964, in order to get help, one needed to dial 0 for the operator who would then patch the call into the police department. So she was R-worded and stabbed outside of the apartment building where she lived in the Kew Gardens neighborhood of Queens, New York. And then 2 weeks after her unalivement, the New York Times published an article. Oh, and now this is just the standard story that you get. And I'm going to go and I'm going to change some things, but I'm just going to give you the standard story. Erroneously claimed that 37 witnesses saw or heard the attack and that none of them called the police or came to her aid. Now, frankly, that is the story that I have known my entire life. Like, oh my God, this happened, and it did happen. Clearly, nobody came to her aid. This man was R-wording her. People were looking out the window. This is an apartment complex near other apartment complexes in New York where all the apartment buildings are closely spaced together. So the incident prompted inquiries into what became known as the bystander effect. And by the way, we see this every day. When there's a crime on the New York City subway or a street anywhere, what do people do? They now have their iPhones and they film it. So the bystander effect, as far as I'm concerned, is alive and well. In any event, that is what created this term, bystander effect, and or it was called the Genovese syndrome. And the unalivement became part of psychology textbooks for the next 4 decades. However, the researchers claim, oh, well, this really didn't happen. Okay, sure. Her name was Catherine Susan Genovese. She was born on July 7th, 1935. And she was 28 on March 13, 1964, when she was unalived. She was the oldest of 5 children of Italian Americans parents. Rachel, who's Rachel and Vincent Genovese, and she was raised Catholic. She lived in a brownstone, at St. John's Place in Park Slope, a very desirable neighborhood even in those days, in Brooklyn, populated mainly by families of Italian and Irish heritage. And then in her teen years, she attended the all-girl Prospect Heights High School, where she was recalled as being very self-assured and being really, having a really good disposition. In 1954, um, after her mother witnessed an unalivement, so her mother too had seen somebody being tragically unalived. I mean, New York City, we had a lot of this ongoing, and it still happens. Genovese's family moved to New Canaan, Connecticut, where the parents felt they were safer. Okay, so Genovese, who had recently graduated from high school, remained in Brooklyn with her grandparents to prepare for her upcoming marriage. So later that year, she got married, but the marriage was annulled because, it was, she kind of came out of the closet and she was, in fact, a lesbian. And why they decided to put all of this back at the time that she was brutally murdered, I don't know. I mean, because at the time it was not in vogue, let's say, or part of mainstream narrative to be anything other than straight. But there's always an underlying desire to want to tarnish the memory of, especially women, of people who have been the victims of violence. And so then she moved into an apartment in Brooklyn. She worked clerical jobs, but she didn't really like them. So by the late 1950s, she became a bartender. And then in August of 1961, she was briefly arrested for bookmaking. However, she wasn't like a bookie. She had been taking bets on horse races from the patrons of the bar where she worked by the instruction of her boss. And she and another friend were fined $50 each, which let's say in today's, it's 2025, it's the equivalent of maybe $550. And, she was fired despite the fact that all she was doing was following the instructions of her boss. Now, the photograph that the media continues to use, and they even use this on her Wikipedia page, is the mugshot of taken in 1961 when she was arrested. Now, a blogger back in, I don't remember what year, wrote the following, which I'm going to read to you. One night in 1990's Kew Garden, Queens, we parked on a side street and headed towards the block where the bar was. Basically, we left the sidewalk and we were walking through the parking lot, which at that hour of the night was nearly deserted, when Karen, my girlfriend at the time, now this is written by a guy who remembered the incident and lived close by, told me in her usual matter-of-fact tone that Kitty Genovese was murdered around here. And then, of course, he included the infamous mugshot photo, and that stopped me, or rather us, in my tracks. We'd been holding hands at that moment. To this day, whenever I recall that night, I get the chills. That brief moment in my life, coupled with the facts of the unalivement, as originally and ultimately incorrectly reported, were ingrained in my memory. I can still visualize the parking lot's pinkish colored night sky, the color owing to the gleam of the street lights, and he puts a question mark on that. Almost sense that foreboding, seemingly solidified silence, as if a Herculean, sorry, I can't say that word right now. I haven't had any coffee. Had been placed over Kew Gardens. Truth be told, we were certainly in the vicinity. I don't know if we were literally on one of the streets, on which Winston Moseley sank his knife into Kitty Genovese 17 times or not. But, it felt that way. Now, he goes on to report and quote the New York Times and what they originally wrote about. So, for more than half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. Twice, the sound of their voices and the sudden glow of their bedroom lights interrupted him and frightened him off. Each time he returned, sought her out, and stabbed her again. Not one person telephoned the police during the assault. One witness called after the woman was dead. That was 2 weeks ago to the day, but Chief Inspector Frederick Lusson, in charge of the borough's detectives and a veteran of 25 years of homicide investigations, is still shocked. And so he goes on to write that the story, to put it mildly, was incorrect. Moseley attacked Kitty Genovese simply for the reason that he could, meaning he knew no one nearby was willing to directly intervene. The police, however, had been notified. I'm going to just keep reading this. You've already heard my thing. People are apathetic. They were then, they are today. We see this every single day, whether it be TikTok or X or any of the platforms. We see that people are apathetic. However, he goes on to write, the Times, owing up to its flawed reporting in 2012, though as early as 1975, it had noted that some of the original facts had been called into question since the story had first been published. And then the Netflix film, he goes on to say, The Witness, which is a documentary made by Kitty Genovese's brother William, who lost both legs in the Vietnam War, the question is directly raised. The one, no doubt, many of you have figured out by now, and that's the question we began this podcast with. The question about whether or not Kitty Genovese was in fact related to the notorious Genovese crime family. And so he goes on to say that he too had been asked this many times, and the question is no, she was not. Genovese is an Italian surname meaning properly somebody from Genoa in Italy, where that name is very popular. So here it is. So he writes, my take is that the mafia question seems to have been raised by the man who unalived Kitty Genovese. That's right, Moseley himself, which is why it somewhat sickens me to even have to write the story at all. The documentary includes additional nonsense about a man named Dominic who really unalived Kitty while Moseley just waited in a car for him. Dom, then he told his drive-along witness slash pal, never to speak of what happened or else. So he was allegedly threatened never to speak about what happened. And then he writes, Kitty Genovese was, in quotes, was first a tragedy, then a symbol, then a bit of durable urban mythology, wrote the New York Times in 1995, in a classic piece of understatement. That Catherine Genovese, the woman, became a symbol as part of the tragedy, and her story evolved into urban mythology because of one man alone. That paper's longtime, highly respected editor, A.M. Rosenthal. Moseley confessed all to the police. Do you know even, he questions, how he was arrested? It was not the police who found Moseley and brought him in. There you go again. It was not the police. Just like I told you that when I was kidnapped and I heard the person who held me hostage trying to come into my apartment and I called the police, they did not even respond. They did not come to the scene of a crime that was taking place, and I called them twice. So it was not the police who found her killer and brought him in. No, Moseley told how he had stabbed her 17 times and then SA'd her. Moseley had also unalived and R-worded other women prior to the Genovese slaying. But his crimes don't end there, and they even continued after his arrest for her unalivement. And so, anyway, we're now going to be going back and forth into how the New York Times original story and the editor Rosenthal depicted New York City as being ground zero for American apathy. And I'm going to tell you that it probably is. It's probably ground zero for American apathy. But I'm going to add to that that so have the rest of the states in the United States and in the world, because the Hollywood industrial complex, controlled by the intelligence agencies, and the movies full of violence and the music full of violence, primarily against women, has made everyone, has numbed everyone's senses. So if this shocking unalivement of Kitty Genovese, which happened in 1964, became such a popular point of discussion, and really not even about her, and not even to say they were sorry that this happened to her, but they talked about the apathy. And then even the apathy was questioned. So I think the apathy was questioned because of the Hollywood industrial complex and the fact that everyone has become numb to how women are so easily erased, how they can be R-worded or just exterminated and in front of everyone. I know that for me, that's not the case. I remember very specifically having run to Los Angeles because that's the only place where I had friends when I escaped. So I also remember somebody questioning, oh, why did you run to Los Angeles? Well, because that's the only place where I knew people, dear, So don't question where I had to run to stay safe when I escaped my apartment having been held hostage. I went to where I had people that I could trust. Yeah, I had no money. I had only the clothes on my back, and I made it to Los Angeles where my friends protected me. And that was the beginning, frankly, of my quest as to who wanted to unalive me and what got me to where I am today. However, the media has attempted to say that, oh, that was blown out of proportion. I do not believe it was. I believe it was for the first time that truth basically surfaced, that people were, in fact, apathetic to her. In fact, there was an older woman who, at the end, after she was gone, held her in her arms. But it's not like there was a couple of burly guys that came downstairs to help during the attacks that were happening in front of their eyes. And yeah, maybe people called the police, but guess what? The police didn't show up. Okay. And if they had had iPhones, I'm sure we would have been seeing footage of them with iPhones. Now, in California, when I was living there, you get around in cars, and I was in the car with my then husband, and I saw a man grab a woman and start screaming at her. I got out of the car and I walked up to him and I made a scene. And I'm a woman, and I'm not a very big woman at all, but I was just so tired of women having to, like, having no way to defend themselves. How do you defend yourself against somebody that might be 2 times your size and certainly much stronger than you? And this is happening in broad daylight, and nobody else was coming to her rescue. So I got out of my car and I went, and the incident stopped. Now, clearly, I don't know what happened to her. I hope she remained safe. I hope nothing else happened, because I could not, like, say, well, let me, take you wherever you have to go. I mean, I couldn't become her new best friend. I know that when I saw something happening, I did something as a woman who's, again, not very big, and as a woman who myself had just recently been attacked and nobody had helped me. And so this story of Kitty Genovese is a story that I hold dear to my heart, resonates with me, because I too am a woman that no one helped when the time came.